It's an incredible honor for me to be here tonight with you all and with Brendan. There are very few people on this planet who are not family who could ask me to do something 35 days before the most important election in American history, possibly. And Brendan is at the top of that list, possibly the only person I'm not related to who I would never, ever say anything except Hineni, I'm here, whatever you need. And the reason for that is because Brendan has been an absolute hero for my people. He's a righteous among nations. There's a sort of joke that Jews tell where they, talk about which of their friends would hide them. If push came to shove, there's not a single Jew on this planet who has any doubt about Brendan. And at a time deeply lacking in moral clarity and moral seriousness, Brendan has been an absolute stalwart figure. And so to see all of you here tonight to support him in this incredible book that he's written is so deeply moving to me. I'm honored to be here. With you, Brendan, but also with everybody who follows you and who supports you, everyone who supports Spiked and the incredible work that Spiked does just to keep people honest at a time when dishonesty is so heavily rewarded. So thank you, Brendan, for having me and for everything that you have done. You've written this incredible book. It's a Jeremiad against our most loathsome enemies. It's an incredible read. There are so many sentences in it that had me simply pea green with envy that I myself had not written them. And there were many things in it that I myself have said that I have obviously imbibed by osmosis from everything you've been putting out since October 7th, and now am completely ashamed that I didn't even realize where these ideas were coming from. That is how influential you have been. I guess my first question is, why can you see what so many in our milieu cannot see? The moral clarity, where does that come from?
Well, thank you, Batya, for doing this, and thank you for your warm words. And you know that I see you as a beacon of moral clarity as well. I have done for some time. I think the stuff that you do on every issue, but particularly on the working classes and what they need and what they want, it just is that has influenced my thinking hugely as well. So thank you for what you do, and thank you for doing this evening. Really appreciate it. I think, I was thinking about this earlier today, the question of why do I say the things I say about Israel? Why, as you put it, why am I able to see things that maybe other people can't see? You know, I've always been an anti-imperialist by nature. I am against wars of foreign ventures that are foolish and destructive. I was against the Iraq War. I was against the intervention in Afghanistan. I was against the Hillary Clinton-led bombing of Libya in 2011. I've always taken a very strong stance on those kinds of foreign ventures because they are incredibly wasteful, they're incredibly destructive, they usually cause more problems than they solve. In fact, they always do. So I've always had that feeling. But when it comes to Israel, when it has come to the question of people on the streets opposing what they refer to as Israeli warmongering or Israeli imperialism, it has always made me feel incredibly uncomfortable because it has never felt like the anti-war position that I am more familiar with. The anti-war position that I'm more familiar with is a generous one. It's a humanist one. It's one that is concerned for the safeguarding of certain nations, the safeguarding of certain peoples, and the importance of Western powers not splurging so much money and energy and attention on wars and conflicts overseas. It's always been the kind of anti-imperialism I've always stood by has always taken that kind of approach. But when I've seen anti-Israel protests over the past 20 years, they've always felt so much more bitter and wicked in parts, and ironically pro-war rather than anti-war. So they've always had a tendency of being pro-Hamas or pro-Hezbollah. It was about 15 or 20 years ago that there was a march in London where people were chanting, "We are all Hezbollah." And people openly chant for the destruction of the Jewish state, which is the world's only Jewish state. We've seen that over the past year on the manicured lawns of Columbia University, on British campuses as well, on the streets of our cities. We've seen people calling for the violent destruction, the violent dismantling of the world's only Jewish nation. And I've watched this grow over the past decade or 2 decades, and I've thought, this doesn't feel like anti-imperialism as I've known it. This doesn't feel like an anti-war sentiment. This feels far more elemental and guttural and pro-war and anti-Jewish. So it seems to me that it's almost like the anti-imperialism of fools. 100 years ago, we had the socialism of fools, where leftists would end up blaming every ill in capitalist society on the Jewish people. Now we have the anti-imperialism of fools, where you have leftists blaming every ill in the world on the Jewish state. And so I've found myself feeling ever more distant from anti-Israel sentiment, to such an extent that I thought to myself, it's actually really, really important in this day and age to stand with Israel and to say Israel has the right to defend itself against the Islamist enemies on its borders, and everyone who defends democracy and, more importantly, civilization should stand with Israel as it does that.
So I asked you why you think you uniquely can see this in our milieu, and you answered with what it is that you can see, which is a brilliant analysis of that. But at the risk of sounding like an aggressive interviewer, I'm going to put the question to you again. Why do you think you can see this? I mean, so many on the anti-Zionist left would say that they are the true anti-imperialists. They cannot see the simple morality of what you just pointed out. How come you can see it?
I don't think it's because I'm some kind of visionary, because there are other people around the world, and you are included in this, Batya, of course, who are able to see very clearly, in very clear moral terms, what is at stake when Israel is under attack in the way that it currently is, including this evening. In the evening we're talking, Israel is under barbarous attack, both from the Islamic Republic of Iran and also from terrorists in Israel itself. Really disturbing events are taking place as we speak. I don't think I'm a visionary. I mean, I know I'm not a visionary. I would never claim to be. I think it's in large part down to the culture around Spiked. At Spiked, we've always had a really critically minded culture. We're a humanist magazine. We're always concerned with one question: is this course of action going to be good for humankind or not? That really is the driving force of every question we ask ourselves and every position we take. And it's because of that culture of discussion and that culture of open-mindedness and that culture of really trying to drive as much as we can towards the most humanist position on every issue. It's because of that that I've been able to become, I guess, a more critically minded person, someone who asks the right questions, even if one doesn't always arrive at the right answers. And so it's in no small part to my colleagues at Spiked over the past 20 years or so, right through to today, that I've been able to ask those questions and put forward those arguments and develop over time with my team a position that is much more on the side of Israel, on the side of the Jewish state, and on the side of the Jewish people who are under attack in the West, a position where we think, look, we're anti-racists at Spiked, and we recognize that so much of what is being done to Israel is driven by extraordinary animus towards the Jewish people, a fascistic animus towards the Jewish people. And so much of what is happening in the West, on our campuses, in our newspapers, on our streets, seems likewise to be driven by that kind of animus. So I think to answer your question, so that you don't have to ask it again, but please feel free to be as aggressive as you want to be, I think it's because Spiked has very successfully, over the past 2 decades, and it continues right through to today, created, I would say, one of the best cultures in the modern media for asking questions about everything. You know, our motto has always been ban nothing, question everything. And that's the approach we take. And as a result of that approach, we've been able to ask the most important questions about how Israel is viewed over the past few decades and what we might take as a different view.
Characteristically humble and unsatisfying answer, but I'm going to take it anyway. I do consider you to be a visionary, and but I agree with you. The moral courage that I see and spiked every single day, the fearlessness in an environment hostile to moral courage, is something that I think everybody on this call is really, really deeply, deeply appreciative for. How has your work been received around Israel? Have you gotten a positive response? Do you feel isolated as a result of it? Marginalized? What has been the reception to the incredibly important work you've done around this topic?
Well, you know, you get the normal abuse, and I get far less abuse than Jewish people who do when they comment on this issue. But you get the abuse. You know, I get messages saying, calling me a Zio cuck, and you know, asking me how much is Israel paying you. I got this message on Instagram a couple of months ago saying, how much are the Jews paying you to say this stuff? So I responded. I don't normally respond to messages like that, but I responded by saying, I'm sorry, but I block racists. And he said, I didn't say anything racist. I meant to say, how much is Israel paying you? And I thought it was such a brilliant insight. You know, the mask momentarily slipped, as it so often does these days. And this person accidentally said Jew when they probably should have said Zionist. You know, that's how you get away with it these days. You say, how much do the Zionists pay you? Why are you in the control of the Zionists? And we all know exactly what they mean when they say things like that. So I get abuse, I get horrible messages online. Even more worrying is that I often get temporarily suspended. The only social media I use is Instagram because the rest of it is far too rough and ugly for me. I don't like that culture. But I do use Instagram, and I often get temporarily suspended from Instagram simply for saying things that are pro-Israel, simply for saying, look, I stand with Israel and I think anti-Semitism is a real problem. But you get mobs of people mass complaining about you, and then the algorithm does its anti-Semitic business and suspends you for 2 weeks. So that's another response that I've had to some of the stuff I've been doing. So there's been that nasty side to it. But since the 7th of October, if there was one silver lining to this event, which of course there isn't, but if there were to be one, it is the fact that since that pogrom almost a year ago, I have made many more friends, many more connections, and many more people I would call comrades in the good old-fashioned sense. One thing that happened after the pogrom and the stuff that I was writing about it is that I was invited to speak at lots of synagogues in the UK and at Jewish people's homes, and lots of people would come out to hear what I had to say, but more importantly, to express their own frustrations. And I'm talking about predominantly Jewish people who were saying to me, where are the anti-racists in this? Why are they not speaking about the attacks on synagogues or the attacks on Jewish schools? Why are people so wrong and so hateful towards this one country in the world, which is the country that we feel a strong affinity to? So I would say it's one of the great honors of my working life that I was able to stand in front of large gatherings of Jewish people after the 7th of October attacks and say to them, look, there are non-Jews out there who have your back, and I am one of them. And to be able to have done that was extraordinary. So for all the abuse one might get and for all the attacks one might suffer and whatever else it might be, it's only words at the end of the day, I've also made really important new connections and new friendships. And I've been able to say, look, it's not a lost cause. There are people out there who understand the severity of what's happening both within the Middle East itself and also in sections of the West. And we're going to take a stand on it shoulder to shoulder with your community. So to be able to do something like that after the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust has been incredibly important to me.
You also potentially alienated a very powerful friend. You went on Joe Rogan, and I don't know if you were expecting to discuss this, but you put forward the most unbelievable defense of Israel. And it was so amazing. Everyone should really go and watch the episode. I've watched it, I think, 3 times because you stay so calm and he keeps asking you the same question over and over. And it's like, it's almost like you're considering his psychology, considering what is the block he has. And you keep trying to find different, increasingly elegant ways to convince him that the question he keeps posing over and over again is not a morally serious one. And it's such a wonderful, wonderful moment because you're both very engaged in the conversation. It stays very, very civil. But it's truly a remarkable sort of object lesson in how to hold a debate. One of the points you made, you quoted, I believe it was John Stuart Mill, who said that there are things that are worse than war, and one of them is believing that nothing is worse than war, nothing is worth waging a war. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, that's one of my all-time favorite quotes. I mention it quite a lot. I quote it quite a lot. I once wrote it on a piece of paper from a Yoko Ono peace tree at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, because I thought I'm not having all this peace nonsense in the museum. So yeah, it's one of my favorite quotes. And as you say, John Stuart Mill said, war is an ugly thing, but it is not the ugliest thing. Even uglier is the lack of patriotic feeling or any other feeling that thinks nothing is worth a war. That is worse than war. And I really believe that. I'm not a pacifist. I don't like most wars, especially most wars that have been fought over the past 20 years when I've been writing and thinking and getting my ideas out into the public realm. Most of the wars I've seen, I just don't like. I've opposed them. I think they've been pointless. But I'm not a pacifist. I am not someone who thinks that wars should never be fought. And one of the points I made to Rogan is that, surely, Joe, you recognize that sometimes war is necessary. Sometimes an issue cannot be resolved through the political realm or the legal realm or the diplomatic realm. And then push comes to shove and war is really the only way to resolve it. And that goes for, the American Revolution, the American Civil War, various wars we've had in England, particularly the English Civil War. And I mentioned that to Joe as well. That was a 10-year war. It was really 3 years that took place over about 10 years. And it was deadly and horrible. And there were loads of civilian casualties. We have this tendency to think that civilian casualties are a modern phenomenon as a result of airplanes and bombs and missiles and so on. But there were huge numbers of civilian casualties, even in pre-modern or old wars. So those wars were deadly and horrible, and the consequences were bad in the moment, but they were necessary to push society forward and to defend ideas that would end up being beneficial to the majority of people. In the case of the Civil War in America, the idea that slavery is an evil that has no place in a modern democratic society. In the case of the English Civil War from the 1640s, the idea that democracy is important and a king should not have absolute power over a nation. These are important ideas that I think it's worth fighting for. And if we fast forward to the modern era, I think the Jewish homeland is worth fighting a war for. It is worth putting one's neck on the line. Mercifully, we don't have to do it, but there are people in Israel, young people in Israel, who are more than willing to do it, and I think that's something worth fighting for. It is worth fighting for the right of Jewish people to have their own nation, something that they have longed for something that they once had thousands of years ago, and that they've been longing for since, and which became an even more pressing, urgent matter following the enslavement and extermination of the Jews in Europe in the 1940s. I can think of no greater justification for the founding of a modern state than the fact that your people was about to be extinguished. So that's really worth fighting for. It was worth fighting for in 1948 when some Jewish rebels took up arms against the British Empire. And it's worth fighting for today when young Jewish people in Israel are taking up arms against the fascists of Hamas and more recently against the fascist militia of Hezbollah. So that's one of the points I tried to get across to Joe Rogan. I said to him, look, I'm like you, and there are lots of wars of recent times that I just think have been utterly wasteful in terms not only of the amount of resources put into them, but really wickedly wasteful in terms of the lives lost. So I'm with him on that, but I'm not with him if he thinks that just because war is ugly, that means it should never be fought. And I think that's a really important point to get across, especially now when so many younger people in the West have never had to fight for anything. They've never had to risk life and limb to defend their nation or their community or their religion or their history. And that's a very luxurious position for them to be in. And for them to then look down their noses at people their age in the Jewish state who have had to do all those things, I think that is unacceptable.
So well put. Your book is about how a generation of the most educated people in the history of planet Earth failed the great moral test of our time. And I just want to read a quote. You write, "We need to talk about this. We need to talk about the pity for the pogromists that swept the West in the wake of 7th of October. We need to talk about the exhilaration of the educated classes upon seeing kibbutzim invaded and Jews' homes set on fire. We need to talk about the left's rationalization of the pogrom. We need to talk about the fact that when barbarism visited Israel, when fascism reared its head once more, many of our young took its side." Explain why that happened.
I mean, that's what my book tries to do. It tries to remind people of what happened, because I think people have forgotten, and also it tries to put forward some answers for why that happened. But if you cast your mind back, and Batya, you will know about this because you were watching this stuff like the rest of us. But cast your mind back to the days and weeks after the 7th of October pogrom. People were on the streets in the 24 and 48 hours after Hamas's attack. Israel hadn't responded by that point. It certainly hadn't launched its ground invasion of Gaza, which didn't come until the 27th of October. So why were they on the streets? They were on the streets to celebrate the murder of Jewish people. That is what happened. And that didn't just happen in the Middle East. That happened in London, where there was a celebratory gathering outside the Israeli embassy around 36 hours after the pogrom. People were playing music, people were dancing. When people were interviewed by the press, they said, "We support this attack 100%. We knew by that stage what had happened. We knew that Jewish men, women, and children had been raped, murdered, and kidnapped. And people were on the streets celebrating it. And one of the points I make in my book is that this was as sick and perverse as if people in London had poured onto the streets to celebrate Crystal Night. It was the exact same thing. And we would remember, it would be recorded in history if people had poured onto the streets to celebrate Crystal Night. So we should remember that they did it after the 7th of October. We should never forget that relatively substantial numbers of people in London celebrated the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. The same happened in Berlin and in Paris. There were celebratory gatherings in parts of the US as well. People were openly cheering a pogrom. And it was when I saw those things that I thought, this is worse than I thought it was going to be. And in fact, on Spiked, I wrote, Tom Slater, the editor of Spiked, asked me to write about the attack on 7th of October as it was happening. He asked me to give my views as it was happening. So I did that. At the time I wrote that piece, 20 people had been killed in Israel. We knew that 20 people were dead. Of course, that number shot up enormously. And even in that piece, I said the response to this is going to be really bad. But it was so much worse than even I had expected. And, the thing that really turned my mind to think that this is something that requires analysis and opposition was when there were those feral attacks on the kidnapped posters that Jewish people and their allies put up in various cities around the West. You'll remember that there were lots of kidnapped posters, and almost everywhere they were put up, they were attacked. And I would cycle around London, and almost everywhere I went, I would see these posters torn to shreds, hanging, little bits of paper hanging where you might just see an eye or a mouth of the person who was on that poster before it had been attacked by some anti-Semitic piece of shit, if you'll excuse my language. But when I saw those posters being attacked, I just thought, this is a hysterical moment. And then there was a moment in Finchley Road, which is in North London, and it's an area heavily populated with Jewish people. There was a kidnapped poster there of the 3-year-old twins who were kidnapped by Hamas, and someone had daubed Hitler moustaches on the 3-year-old twins. And when that was reported, and very few people commented on this, the anti-racist left said nothing about it. But to my mind, it was one of the worst things I've seen. You know, the daubing of Jewish children with a Hitler moustache, basically the branding of them as fascists, Jewish children as fascists, who presumably deserved what they got, which is that they were kidnapped on 7th of October by Hamas. It was when I saw things like that that I really started to think, okay, so all of the moral rot in Western society, which people will be familiar with, all of the moral decay, the turn against Enlightenment values, the betrayal of civilizational values, it's then that I thought all of that is going to come surging to the surface of society. And I think our chickens have come home to roost. And I think we're now seeing that if you educate a new generation to hate their own societies, to be wary of the claims of Western civilization, to look at their societies as institutionally racist and institutionally Islamophobic and full of, born from the sins of slavery and colonialism. When you continually educate a new generation to have contempt for the communities and societies in which they live, you are going to turn them away from the values of Western civilization and possibly push them into the arms of its opposite. And we saw its opposite on 7th of October, which was a complete tear in the fabric of civilization. And it was one of the worst acts of barbarism of modern times. It ended up not being surprising to me that younger generations in the West who had been educated to hate civilization found themselves warming to barbarism. And I think that's what's at stake when we talk about the fallout from 7th of October.
So where do we go from here with these young people? I mean, can they be reached? How do we reach them? Apart from everyone buying at least 3 copies of Brendan's book and distributing it to every person that you meet, every young person in your life, which everybody should do. I really go back and forth on this. I look at the footage of these, and I call them the know nothing they thems, on college campuses. I mean, I go back and forth when I see this footage between being like, I just want to sit down with this person who I'm sure thinks they are a very good person and explain some things to them, and thinking, they're lost. That's the lost generation. Let's move on. Let's try to reform our institutions. Let's create a very strong youth movement around good values or what have you. Where do you fall on that? And if you believe they can be reached, how do we do that?
Yeah, I believe they can be reached. It might not sound it from the book. Someone said to me the other day that he loved the book, but it has a powerful note of despair, and I guess it does, inevitably. So you might not guess it from the book or some of the things that we're going to be talking about this evening, but I am generally quite optimistic. I'm optimistic about the human condition. I have always, I've always thought that we can pull through the problems that we face, even a problem as profound as the anti-civilizational trends that are currently striking many parts of our society. So I do think young people can be reached. But one of the problems is university. That is one of the problems. And I don't put all the blame on universities, but it is one of the serious problems. So it's not surprising to me that the places where we saw some of the worst anti-Semitism and the worst Israelophobia were on campuses, and particularly on the Ivy League campuses, the leafiest campuses, the campuses where the woke ideology has a really strong grip. The kind of campuses where all of these crazy ideas have been gathering steam for some time. It's really interesting if you look at American universities over the past few years, and everyone will be familiar with this because we talked about it and we laughed about it. These are the kinds of places where people would say it's racist for a white guy to eat sushi, or it's transphobic to dress up as Caitlyn Jenner on Halloween, or it's racist to ask a black person or a brown skinned person, where are you from? they had this uber sensitivity to everyday conversation, icebreakers, the eating of food, the singing of songs, the wearing of clothes, everything. They had this kind of extreme psychic vulnerability where they interpreted everything as a racist slur or an attack on them as a person. Those same universities are now cheering, some of them are anyway, the worst racist attack of modern times. So at George Washington University, for example, in America, a couple of months before the 7th of October attack, they had this huge controversy over their sports teams because their sports teams were called the Colonials. And there was this huge uproar. How dare you use the word colonials? It's an attack on us. It's racist. It's terrible. And they kicked up a storm about this one word. And then after the 7th of October, on George Washington University, someone projected the words "Glory to our martyrs" on the campus library. Elsewhere, they chanted openly in support of Hamas, not even the kind of coded pro-Hamas positions that we've seen on some. They openly chanted in favor of their martyrs, in favor of the people who had just raped Jewish women and killed Jewish children and kidnapped Jewish grandmothers. These are the people who were so sensitive to the question of racism that they couldn't bear to hear the word colonials, now celebrating an actual pogrom. So, and I cover that in my book, and I look at these profound contradictions, and I do ask that question that you've just asked, which is, are these people just beyond saving? But I don't believe that they are. I do think that a change in culture is possible, a change in values is possible, and even a change in what the modern academy focuses on and the ideology that swirls all around it. I do think that's possible. It will be hard work, and it will mean restoring the university's faith in enlightenment and learning and civilization, but it's not beyond our ability to do something like that. And I think that's the first step to pulling these young people back from the precipice of barbarism that they now stand on.
Before my next question, I just want to give a shout out to Moshe Foreman, who writes in the chat that he's near Tel Aviv and he's listening to this from his bomb shelter, and sends a big thank you to you, Brendan, for all of your support. I want to talk about the class angle here. Be safe, Moshe. You have this amazing quote in the book on mass-produced keffiyehs made in China, and I want to read this quote because it belongs in a museum. The quote, "Made in China radicalism of the keffiyeh classes is commodified resistance summed up," you write. "Nothing better captures the moral unworldliness of the pro-Palestine set than the fact that they're sartorial signifiers of status," again, a phrase that made me pea green with envy, "were likely made by hyper-exploited workers in the world's largest unfree state. That the scarves they put on to show how much they care for Palestine were likely weaved by people who lack the fundamental rights of freedom of speech and democratic enfranchisement. That their noisy displays of moral concern for Palestine are being facilitated by poorly paid weavers in an authoritarian state for whom their moral concern is thin indeed, if not non-existent. It is even possible that Uyghurs made their keffiyehs, given that tens of thousands from this repressed people have been compelled by the Chinese regime to work in factories, including textile factories. It is a coveting of suffering," you write. "The keffiyeh classes, it seems to me, crave the moral rush of oppression, the thrill of persecution. They pull on the garb of a beleaguered people in order to escape, however fleetingly, the pampered reality of their own lives in order to taste that most prized of social assets in the woke era, victimhood." Um, to everybody listening, I implore you, buy this book. It is full of unbelievable paragraphs like this. So much of the hatred of Israel right now is, in the West at least, this elite phenomenon around what you call these luxurious faux outrage events that are in fact, oppression envy, people who are so pampered in a context that only recognizes the virtue of victimhood. So they literally have to assume it with these slave embroidered keffiyehs. Tell us a little bit more about how this intersects with all of your work on the class divide.
Yeah, so in that chapter in particular, the cult of the keffiyeh, I really do explore, what the keffiyeh classes really represent, and I find them so grimly intriguing, which is why I wanted to have that chapter in the book, because I think it is oppression envy, it is victimhood envy, and Tom Wolfe wrote scathingly about radical chic in the early 1970s. And the point I make in that chapter is that the pulling on of the keffiyeh by all the kind of sartorial signifiers of the luxury belief class, that's something even worse than radical chic. It's victimhood chic. It's interesting that they never get accused of the sin of cultural appropriation, whereas everyone else who wears the clothing or the hairstyles or listens to the music of a group less powerful than their own, they will instantly be accused of cultural appropriation. I think the idea of cultural appropriation is nonsense. I think people should mingle and mix and engage and enjoy whatever cultures they want to. But it's interesting that people who wear the keffiyeh never get accused of that, because to my mind, they have morally appropriated the entire sense of victimhood of the Palestinian people. They pulled on the whole thing. They're really trying to get a moral kick from aligning themselves with what they view, wrongly in my view, but what they view as a uniquely oppressed people, the most oppressed people that has ever existed. And you remember at Columbia University when they had the Gaza encampment, one of the leaders of the encampment said, "We need humanitarian aid. We're starving. Why are the university bosses starving us?" And then there was this fantastic video clip of some of the students, all of them wearing keffiyehs, of course, at the gates to the university, receiving humanitarian aid through the gates. And it was probably just a blueberry muffin from the local Starbucks. It was, but they were lapping up this sensation of temporarily being the wretched of the earth. That feeling, we might be the most privileged kids in America studying at this glorious campus in New York City, but for a minute we can feel wretched and we can feel victimized and we can really cosplay essentially as an oppressed people. I just found it really grotesque. I mean, it was both comedic and gross. Because it really was oppression envy. And one of the points I make in the book, and I think this is really worth people thinking about, is that on the one hand it's just quite funny and ridiculous, but on the other hand I think this culture actually feeds into Hamas's strategy. It feeds into the tactics that Hamas openly adopts. Because when you have a culture in the West, not just amongst young activists, but in the media and in certain political circles, a culture where they almost crave images of Palestinian suffering in order to make themselves feel virtuous through sharing them or talking about them. When you have sections of the West, influential sections of the West, who crave images of Palestinian suffering, you are going to goad Hamas to provide more of those images. You are going to encourage Hamas certainly not to call a ceasefire, which it ought to have done long ago, and not to lay down arms, but instead to revel in some of the destruction that we've seen in Gaza as a consequence of the war that Hamas started, and to revel in it because they know it will win them points and support amongst the West that craves these images of Palestinian victimhood. And Sinwar in Gaza has made this point explicitly. He has said, the more martyrs we have, the more of a boon we will receive amongst our supporters in the West. So there is now this horrible symbiotic relationship between a Western activist class that is myopically obsessed with Palestinian suffering to the neglect of every other issue on earth, and the willingness of Hamas to continue fighting against a foe it could never defeat, i.e. Israel, because it knows that at least it will be able to present itself to those people as the most wretched group on earth. So that connection between those two sections, between the kind of witless activist class over here and those evil anti-Semitic armies in Gaza, I think that relationship is something really worth analysing and critiquing.
Let's take some questions. Stephen Schoen asks, what would you suggest are the best key points to make to family and friends who are fashionably pro-Palestine?
Ooh, that's a great question. And I have a little bit of personal experience of this because I've got one family member who is fashionably pro-Palestine. I come from a slightly working class background. If it was for a more upper middle class background, there would be far more fashionably pro-Palestine people, I'm sure, but I only have one. So I have had these discussions, I have had some of these arguments. I think it's very difficult. It's one of those issues, one of the problems with the era of identity politics is that people wrap up their positions with their whole sense of self. So if you criticize, for example, if you criticize the transgender ideology, they interpret that as a genocidal attack on their whole being. So it makes it very difficult to have rational discussions. And that's the case for pro-Palestine position taking as well, because that has become such a central feature, such a key luxury belief for the influential sections of society that pushing back against it can be hard, and they will cling on to it for dear life because it's the means through which you gain access to political high society. It's the means through which you retain your sense of worth in certain upper middle class circles. So it can be very difficult to prick it and to push back against it. But I would, the point I make is just to remind people of what happened on 7th of October, and just to say to them, okay, fine, you think that the Palestinians have grievances, and the Palestinians do have grievances. There are lots of things that happen to the Palestinians that are bad and wrong and make their lives difficult. But since when was the murder of civilians a legitimate response to a political grievance? Since when was an act of fascistic mass murder a legitimate response to feeling that your life is slightly out of control? It reminds me of when lots of young Muslims in Europe went to join ISIS in the mid 2010s, and there were loads of weird articles in the press saying, well, they experienced Islamophobia, they felt dislocated from their own societies. And I remember saying, since when has traveling 3,000 miles to drive a truck with people's heads hanging off the back of it, since when was that a legitimate response to feeling that you might be suffering some racism or some oppression? It doesn't make sense. So I think teasing out the contradictions in the pro-Palestine position and asking why so-called anti-racists supported a racist attack, and why people who present themselves as progressive have found themselves on the same side as one of the most regressive movements on earth, i.e. Hamas and their masters in the Islamic Republic. Asking those kinds of probing questions just to say to people, how did you arrive here? How did you get here? And is this the right position to hold? That can be a way to start dismantling some of their views, I think.
And of course, buying Brendan's book for them would go a long way, I believe. Is it your sense? I mean, in America, there's definitely the sort of pro-Palestinian versus being pro-Israel maps very, very easily onto the class divide. Nothing predicts for feeling positively toward Palestinians over Israel, like having a college degree. Is that true in the UK as well?
I think it might be less true in Europe than it is in America. I've clocked that in America. I find it so interesting. If you look at the polls and the surveys, you will find that the non-university educated, so the more working class sections of society, tend to be more sympathetic towards Israel and vice versa. I think it's probably partly the case in the UK and other parts of Europe, but I think it probably doesn't map entirely neatly because, unlike America, sadly, Europe has a long history of anti-Semitism. I don't think everyone in Europe is an anti-Semite by any stretch of the imagination, but we do have a long, complicated history with Jewish people. And that sadly does influence how people read this conflict, how they view Israel, what they think about it. I think it probably influences people in the influential sections of society more, but I think it probably does have an impact on society more broadly. So that's one important difference between America and Europe, of course. And I think that changes the way in which people here look at the conflict in Israel-Hamas.
You've touched on this, but Mark is asking, why do so many Western people fail to see Hamas for exactly what they are?
It boggles the mind why people fail to see this. I think one reason is that we're often just not really told the truth. The media coverage, the mainstream media coverage, with many honourable exceptions, has not been very good. And I was watching BBC News the other night, and they had the most extraordinary line. Their newscaster said, Israel has expanded its war by bombing the Houthis in Yemen after the Houthis fired missiles at Tel Aviv. And I was watching this thinking, am I losing my mind here? Or is that the worst, most deceptive sentence in modern day journalism? Because, of course, what that means is that it was the Houthis that expanded the war by firing missiles at Tel Aviv. And Israel responded to that expansion of the war by firing missiles back at the Houthis. So that drip effect of either outright media dishonesty or just a kind of a coverage that doesn't really get to the truth, that can have a big impact. One of the things I struggle with in relation to Hamas is trying to convince people that about the true nature of this movement. But it can be done. You can point them to the founding covenant of Hamas from 1987, 1988, which commits it to a genocidal struggle against the Jews. Hamas is a genocidal terrorist organization. You can point them to recent statements by Hamas leaders where they encourage people to buy 5 shekel knives and use them to kill Jews. Same with Hezbollah. You can point them to some of the comments that Hassan Nasrallah has made in recent years, where he referred to Zionism as a cancerous presence in the Middle East. In other words, kick the Jews out of Israel. So there are things you can do to really highlight the extraordinary, deep-seated anti-Semitism and racial hatred of these movements, and the regressive nature of these movements, and the homophobia and misogyny of these movements. Hamas and Hezbollah are violently anti-equality. And yet we have groups like Queers for Palestine essentially cheering them on, completely unaware that if they ever went to certain parts of Palestine, they'd be thrown off the top of a building faster than they could say free Palestine. That kind of, the cluelessness is deep. But I think it is possible to really draw attention to the true nature of these movements and the extent to which they represent Iran's interests. And that can be a useful way, I think, of chipping away at some people's delusions about what Hamas is.
You make an amazing point in the book. What you brought it up briefly, but in your discussion of Tom Wolfe's Radical Chic and how in the 70s, they loved the Black Panthers because they were macho and aggressive and badass and and had a lot of agency and didn't care about the rules. And now there's this worship of abjection, of weakness, of victimhood, and you could so see that in the discourse. They used to love them, the Palestinians, because they were freedom fighters, and our fought would dispatch these mustachioed hotties to college campuses, to woo the co-eds, and now it's like they worship their abjection, and that includes Hamas as well. I wanted to on the question of convincing people, you did something. I don't know if you realized you were doing this on the Joe Rogan show, but every time he made a point, you would go out of your way to try to find something in it to agree with, which is a big sort of hostage negotiation technique of trying to get somebody to see things the way you do. If you start by telling them that you see what they're seeing, you see what they're getting at, you're not dismissing their position, you recognize why they believe that, and then you address it. That tactic is a very powerful one. Ian Barker has a great question, foreign policy question. Why do you think so many nations seem so keen to mediate this conflict rather than support Israel to defend Western values?
Yeah, great question. I was thinking about this recently because, after the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, the spiritual leader and Secretary General of Hezbollah, I was so horrified by the West's response, by the response from Western capitals, from Western leaders, because, we had Joe Biden. He expressed a kind of soft sense of satisfaction that Nasrallah had been taken out. But then he said, but everyone needs to calm down, stop it, relax, de-escalate, etc., etc. The British government as well was barely said anything, and certainly didn't welcome the assassination of this ruthless terror overlord who has inflicted so much barbarism and sorrow, not only on the people of Israel, but on people in Lebanon, in people in Syria, where Hezbollah played an important role in crushing some of the more rebellious movements who moved against Assad. This is a man who has inflicted extraordinary pain and bloodshed on very significant numbers of people, and yet from Western capitals there was barely any response, certainly no celebration. We had the surreal situation where there were Muslims in Syria, Lebanon and Iran who were celebrating the death of Nasrallah, especially feminists and freedom fighters in Iran who see Hezbollah as both an extension and a fortification of their own regime's ruthless theocratic rule. So you had those people celebrating it, and then in the West, on our campuses and on our streets, you had people essentially crying. Oh my God, I can't believe Nasrallah's dead. It's so sad. I think when it comes to Western governments, I think it can be explained through moral cowardice and political cluelessness. So they are moral cowards because they are, and by the way, these are people who have launched some of the most destructive wars of recent decades, who are now wringing their hands over Israel fighting a just war against the anti-Semitic armies that attacked it over the past year. So they say, oh, stop it. It's too much. It's out of control. We can't have Israel standing up for itself to this extent. So there's moral cowardice, that extreme unwillingness to support a supposed ally while it fights for its life against the terrorist armies that surround its borders. So there's real moral cowardice there, and political cluelessness. I think so much of our political establishment fails to recognize what is at stake in the post-7th October moment. And I think what is at stake are two things: the continued existence of the Jewish state and the values of Western civilization. That is what we're talking about here. The clash between Israel and its legion enemies is a clash that is designed to defend the continued existence of a Jewish homeland, and it is also a defense of Western civilizational values against the barbarism of the Islamist ideology and against the regressive ideologies that fuel movements like the Houthis and Hamas and Iran itself. This, to me, is a pretty straightforward clash. I don't think much is straightforward in modern politics. I'm always interested in complexity and nuance and really teasing out the difficult questions. But to my mind, this is pretty straightforward. You are either on the side of a barbarous theocratic state that oppresses and murders women, workers and minorities, and which goaded its proxies to carry out the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, or you're on the side of Israel. Pick your side.
There's a question here from Moshe Yehuda. Kimi Badmoch. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but I did see this video. There was a video circulating on social media where this person said that not all cultures are equal, and there was this big radical backlash to it. Do you think that the sort of insistence or the inability to make qualitative distinctions and the resultant moral relativism contribute to the rise of Jew hatred and anti-Semitism? And Moshe asked, do you see a path forward to restore the attributes of critical thinking and public moral clarity?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so recently Kemi Badenoch, who is in the running to be the leader of the Conservative Party, very interesting politician, she made a comment that not all cultures are equally valid. And it caused a bit of a storm. People were saying, "Oh God, that's racist," and of course, it's not racist at all. It's a very apt and knowledge-based observation of society. So, for example, Afghanistan over the past couple of days has forbidden children from divorcing their husbands. It will not let young girls who are forced into marriages with men get divorced from them. That is an inferior culture to 21st century Britain. And I'm more than happy to say that. I'm more than happy to make that moral judgment that if you are forcing girls of any age, but especially girls under the age of 18, to marry men, then your culture is morally inferior to mine. And thankfully, over time, over the centuries, Britain doesn't do that, and we now have something like sexual equality. So when people say that not all cultures are equally valid, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it is true that this culture of moral relativism, this unwillingness to make those kinds of judgments about the different cultures that people adhere to or the different ideologies that people support, the unwillingness to do that is one of the things that propels the Western sympathy for Hamas and the Western sympathy for Hezbollah. And one of the points I make in my book is that a problem we face is that this conflict after the 7th of October has been interpreted through the very narrow prism of identity politics. And under the ideology of identity politics, white people are all oppressors and brown people are all oppressed. It's this very kind of moral binary position that allows no nuance or historical context or anything else. And the historical context in this situation is that Israel is not a white country. In fact, white Jews are in a minority in Israel, and a majority of Jews are from North Africa or from different heritages. And they're there, by the way, because they got forced out of the Arab lands in which they used to live, but no one wants to talk about that. So it's wrong in that sense to refer to Israel as a white supremacist nation or even as a white nation. And it's also wrong to say that Palestinians are incapable of oppression, because we saw with our own eyes on the 7th of October that a movement like Hamas is very much capable of oppression and capable of some of the most unspeakable violence we've seen in recent times. So I do think the culture of moral relativism and the culture of identitarianism have really contributed to how skewed people's interpretation of this conflict has become. And I'm starting to think that there is a kind of double racism here. So there's the racism of that kind of feverish obsession with the Jewish state as the source of every ill in the world. That is clearly anti-Semitic to my mind. But then there's also the corresponding racism of never holding Palestinians responsible for anything, never blaming Hamas for anything, always seeing Israel as the only adult actor in this scenario, the only autonomous actor in the Middle East, the only person whose decisions really make a difference and matter and change events, whereas the Arabs are always presented as these hapless, slightly pathetic victims to whom things are done. So there's a double racism when you blame Jews for everything and absolve Arabs of everything. I think that is racism on both sides, and I prefer a much more anti-racist approach, which both defends the right of Jews to their own homeland and says that a group like Hamas is a regressive movement that deserves critique both from Arab people and non-Arab people who want to live in a freer, more progressive world.
Well, on that note, everybody, please go buy not one copy, not two copies, but three copies of Brendan's unbelievably important and beautiful, moving book. Brendan, thank you for this and for everything, for the book. You're one of these people that I know your place in heaven is guaranteed, and God bless you and everybody that you love and care about. And just from the bottom of my heart, thank you for everything.
Thank you so much, Batya.